Yeah, dear Dr. Aykut, dear Dr. Donges, dear Dr. Seiger, dear participants, friends, and colleagues. On behalf of the German Research Foundation, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the participants of our second Heinz Maier-Leibnitz-Prize online conference. My name is Ingrid Größmann, and I'm Director of the DFG Office Japan and Deputy Head of the International Affairs Division of the DFG. I'm also heading the Asia Pacific team, and I'm the German director of the Sino-German Center for Research Promotion in Beijing. Under the topic Planetary Boundaries and Social Dynamics of Decarbonization, our conference today will take a look at the state of planet Earth in the year of 2022. We will discuss what is needed in order to face climate change, one of the most urgent global challenges of our times. That Germany and Japan are well equipped to be partners in the fight against climate change was again emphasized by the visit of German Federal President Steinmeier to Kyoto in November. His visit to Kyoto and our conference take place 25 years after the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It has been adopted in December 1997. In his speech in Kyoto, Bundespräsident Steinmeier stressed the importance of international cooperation and exchange of knowledge in order for us to have a chance of successfully tackling his task facing humanity. And the DFG Japan team is committed to support international cooperation and the exchange of knowledge between Germany and Japan together with the German Center for Research and Innovation in Tokyo. In that sense, I would like to thank the DWIH for the successful cooperation and support while organizing this event. And thank you to all participants for joining us today. Let me also say a few words on the occasion of this event, which we hold in honor of two Heinz Maier-Leibnitz-Prize winners. The DFG has been awarding researchers in the starting phase of their careers with the Heinz Maier-Leibnitz-Prize together with the Federal Ministry of Education and Research since 1977. In recognition of their outstanding achievements, the prize is intended to assist prize winners in excelling in their scientific careers. The prestigious prize is awarded for pursuing curiosity-driven research. Starting in 2023, the prize is to be realigned and transferred to the DFG's funding portfolio. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Stefan Aykut and Dr. Jonathan Donges, both recipients of the Heinz Maier-Leibnitz-Prize in 2019. Both have had an extraordinary and international scientific career. Stefan Aykut is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for Sustainable Society Research at the University of Hamburg. He examines how modern societies engage with global ecological problems, especially climate change, and how ecological crises are scientifically interpreted, politically processed, and channeled into programs of social change, and how new conflicts, but also new forms of social coordination emerge in this process. He is involved in the Cluster of Excellence, Climatic Change and Society at the University of Hamburg. Dr. Aykut contributed to the Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook 2021. Assessing the plausibility of deep decarbonization by 2050, where he presents societal factors that constitute the main barriers and the main drivers of low carbon climate futures. We will hear more about it in his talk. Let's come to Jonathan Donges. He is co-leader of the Future Lab on Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene and working group leader on Whole Earth System Analysis in Research Department on Earth System Analysis of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Dr. Donges' research focuses on dynamics of planetary scale socio-ecological systems, climatic and social tipping elements, as well as their dynamics and interactions. He also works on the application of these methods to climate physics and Earth system analysis. This year, the Potsdam Institute celebrates 30 years of integrated climate impact research and we are looking forward to hear more about its groundbreaking research. Well, I'm very glad that we are organizing today's event in your honor, Dr. Aykut and Dr. Donges, and I'm looking forward to your talks. Now, finally, let me pass over and first introduce today's moderator. Leading us through our conference is Dr. Anna Julia Seiger. She is research assistant at the Institute for Media and Information Law at Albert Ludwigs University Freiburg and fellow at the Integrative Research Institute Law and Society at Humboldt University Berlin. Her research focuses on international climate change law, sustainability, governance, and comparative international law. She will give us an introduction into today's topic from the angle of the worldwide trend of climate change litigation. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Japan team, especially Mira Bauersachs, for the meticulous preparation of this meeting. I'm looking forward to challenging and inspiring talks and lively discussions during today's online conference. And now I would like to hand over to you, Dr. Seiger, and the screen is yours.
Many thanks for this warm introduction and a warm welcome also from my side. Let me share my screen with you to start the presentation. I'm very glad to introduce you to this conference with a presentation on climate change litigation. I will address the question whether and why we still need international climate change law, despite a rapidly changing climate, and what role domestic courts may play in this respect. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. These are the words by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres a few weeks ago in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at COP27. With this forceful image, Guterres points towards today's highly insufficient climate actions to limit dangerous climate change. Do we still need international climate law? One might ask in light of the current state of the global climate, because international climate law already exists since the 1990s. The most recent milestone in international climate change law was certainly the adoption of the Paris Agreement at COP21 in 2015. The Paris Agreement has famously introduced the long-term temperature goal of limiting the rise of global average temperature to 1.5, or at least to well below 2 degrees Celsius. This target has been determined on the basis of the planetary boundary for the global climate, of which we will hear in detail in the following presentation. From a legal perspective, this goal illustrates that the Paris Agreement takes a truly planetary perspective. The last years have shown that this planetary perspective in international climate change law must trickle down to the domestic level, where the concrete climate protection actions need to be decided and implemented. So legally spoken, top-down elements and bottom-up elements need to go hand in hand. In this sense, the Paris Agreement, next to its long-term temperature goal, relies on the parties' nationally determined contributions, NDC. However, a synthesis report published by the UN in October this year contends that with today's climate actions, the world is on track for around 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. One possible avenue for anchoring climate protection action on the domestic level at the bottom of the planet is climate litigation. Climate litigation, we have heard it, has become a worldwide trend. Its impacts go far beyond the courtroom. It has even been framed as a social process by our second speaker today. It is difficult to conceptualize climate litigation as a singular phenomenon. How the planetary perspective trickles down to the domestic level needs to be answered according to each jurisdiction's specific context. In light of climate change, especially the contexts of countries in the global south need to be considered. Here, I would like to point our attention to two cases according to the countries represented at this conference. One decided in March 21 by the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, and another case currently pending before the Supreme Court in Japan. In the German climate change case, children and youth from Germany, individuals from Nepal and Bangladesh, as well as environmental organizations, alleged a violation of their fundamental rights enshrined in the German constitution, the Basic Law. They claimed that the Federal Climate Protection Act violated their individual rights. The act, according to the claimants, failed to introduce a sufficient legal framework for rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. So there was no legal framework necessary to meeting the Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal. In an innovative and unexpected decision, the Constitutional Court ruled that the alleged provisions are incompatible with fundamental rights. It found that the act violated all fundamental rights of the Basic Law in their intertemporal dimension, since it prevented a fair distribution of greenhouse gas reduction obligations over time. The court ruled that one generation must not be allowed to consume large portions of the CO2 budget while bearing a relatively minor share of the reduction effort if this would involve leaving subsequent generations with a drastic reduction burden and expose their lives to comprehensive losses of freedom. In the Japanese case, the Citizens Committee on the Kobe coal-fired power plant challenged the authorization of 2 coal-fired power plants in Kobe City before the Osaka District Court and subsequently before the Osaka High Court. The claimants are Kobe residents. They requested the revocation of the notice of finalization to construct and operate 2 coal-fired power plants issued by the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. The claimants asked the court to recognize the illegality of the Electricity Business Act because it failed to regulate CO2 emissions by thermal power plants. Like in the German case, the claimants referred to the obligation to regulate CO2 emissions today to be able to meet the Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal in light of the Japanese reduction targets. The Kobe citizens have filed a final appeal in May this year to the Supreme Court, where it is currently pending. The Osaka High Court found that the authorization was lawful. As they live in Kobe, the court affirmed that the claimants had standing in relation to health protection matters. However, in relation to climate protection, the High Court contended that the claimants had no standing according to Article 9, Paragraph 1 of the Administrative Case Litigation Act. The High Court found the interest in not being damaged by the adverse effect of CO2 emitted by the coal-fired power plants is not an individual interest. While climate protection is an important interest and an urgent political issue for humanity, according to the court, at present, it should be pursued as a general public interest within the framework of general politics. However, the court points towards possible future changes of its jurisprudence. It contends if national and international discussions on the interest in climate protection measures change, climate protection might become an individual interest. Even if those cases differ as to their reasoning as well as to their outcome and of course as to their contexts, the claimants still encounter similar problems in court. Very central is the hurdle of standing in relation to climate goals, that is, the possibility to be heard in court. This complex relationship of international climate goals and subjective rights protection on the domestic level is typical to climate litigation. The Paris Agreement's planetary perspective is crucial in this respect. Domestic courts need to translate this planetary perspective on the domestic level. In the German case, large parts of the decision actually refer to the general constitutional principle of environmental protection enshrined in Article 20A Basic Law. Article 20A Basic Law, the court contends, is concretized by the long-term temperature goal rooted in the Paris Agreement. From this, the court derives a national CO2 budget binding the German legislator when addressing climate change mitigation. So the court translates the planetary perspective into domestic law. Moreover, it establishes a constitutional obligation to cooperate on an international level in relation to climate protection. In the Japanese case, so far, there has not been a translation of the planetary perspective into domestic law. However, There is a reference to the international level in the obiter dicta by the High Court, when it suggests that the manifestation of international climate change law guides the domestic understanding of climate protection as either a public interest or an individual interest. We will see what the Supreme Court decision will bring in this respect. Already now, we can contend that for both cases, the Paris Agreement, and so international climate change law, is absolutely necessary, as it makes the planetary perspective visible on the domestic level. Domestic courts fulfill a hinge function. They link domestic climate protection measures to the international long-term temperature goal rooted in Article 2, paragraph 1, letter A of the Paris Agreement. Domestic courts translate the planetary perspective into individual rights protection. And the difficulties that they encounter are like a mirror for the legal, social, and ecological changes at stake. In this sense, climate change litigation illustrates the necessary socio-ecological changes in the process of transforming our societies in line with the planetary boundaries and the stabilization of the Earth systems. To exit the highway to climate health, we need to rely on a vivid exchange among different disciplines, and this is exactly what we are doing at today's conference. I'm glad to introduce the two talks by Heinz Maier-Leibnitz-Prize winners Dr. Aykut and Dr. Donges. Dr. Donges will now present on planetary boundaries and tipping points in the Earth systems, risks and opportunities. Dr. Donges, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much also for the warm words and the nice introduction. So let me also share my screen. Okay. Okay, I trust you can see it in full screen. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to start with talking about the reason of why we need climate change litigation, the large risks posed by anthropogenic climate change, and then I will transition more to recent research and recent proposals about opportunities that also could emerge from tipping points, but rather social tipping points for rapid decarbonization, for example. And this will be the overall story that I'm I'm going to tell in this talk. So first, to quickly show you the scope of the challenge, if we look at paleoclimate the past 20,000 years since the last glacial maximum, when most of Germany, at least northern Germany, for example, was covered by ice, we've seen a global warming of 3 degrees, which lasted 10,000 years into the Holocene, which was a really stable and balmy climate that allowed the development of our complex civilizations. And these complex civilizations have then produced, with industrialization, rapid climate change that, when projected into the future, would take a truly geological perspective in amplitude up to much larger than the warming from the last glacial maximum to the Holocene, and also much more rapid, up to 100 times faster warming than the natural warming that we've seen in the past 20,000 years. And this is not the only challenge that our planet is facing. The unprecedented growth of and resource intensity of our industrial civilizations have produced the great acceleration, which is an increase in Earth system pressures, not only on climate, but also on biosphere integrity, on biodiversity, for example, on the biosphere, via agriculture, deforestation, fires, plastic pollution, etc. And this is not only on these pressures are of course driven by social developments, economic growth, that you can see here on the left-hand side, the growth of GDP, world population, etc., which has been, part of it has been exponential for the past several decades. And to the planetary boundaries, our framework for that was designed to capture the state of the planet with respect to these to the main anthropogenic pressures that have been identified and that are acting now to drive our planet out of the Holocene, out of the space where we have developed our civilizations to a space on this highway to hell that Anna Julia mentioned, that we know that there will be a much warmer climate, much more hostile to sustainable developing human societies. And again, the planetary boundary frameworks shows that the pressures are not unidimensional. They're not just about climate change. We are leaving the Holocene not only along the climate dimension, but also, for example, importantly, along the dimension of biosphere integrity, which is the second core boundary that has been identified, because climate and the biosphere, of course, together create the living conditions for our human societies, the basic foundation of life that on our planet. And the recent assessment that we are currently, it's a new paper on planetary boundaries under review, shows that already 6 planetary boundaries have been transgressed. This means that the Holocene safe operating space for humanity has already been left for 6 of the main planetary processes that have been identified. And it's actually only still within boundaries for ocean acidification and ozone depletion, plus the aerosol loading, which is not yet quantified on this slide. So overall, the important message is the Earth system pressures, the challenges that we are facing in the Anthropocene, they are multidimensional and also they are interacting. Climate change is not independent from biosphere integrity destruction, for example. Both are amplifying each other. And this creates additional risks and challenges. Now, as I already mentioned the word, these unprecedented pressures, the geological forces that our societies have unleashed now, have created the need for a new word for this planetary era that we are living in. And this is the Anthropocene, a term that has been used a lot and debated a lot in the past decade, and is still up to scientific discussion how it will be exactly defined. But scientists are now converging towards a beginning of the Anthropocene in 1950 or 1951. So there's some little error bar there still. This is the time when the pressures after the Second World War with new economic institutions and developments really started to increase exponentially. And these social technological network dynamics that our human societies have created are now really a dominant process in the Earth system on many dimensions, not just on the climate dimension. And I think this is the main message of the planetary boundary frameworks. We need to consider all these things together. But now let me zoom in a bit on, again, on the climate, because this is my main speciality here and also the speciality of our institute, the Potsdam Institute, of course. So let me focus on a particular class of risk that is created by the so-called climate tipping elements in the climate system. These are critical parts of the planetary machinery that have the potential that can become unstable under anthropogenic pressures, that can disintegrate or collapse in response to even small perturbations. And there has been a recent very detailed literature assessment and new research published by our colleagues in Science here just a few months ago. This is the Armstrong-McKay paper that is cited below. And also importantly, to create this link here, the climate tipping elements have also been discussed now as a potential a global commons in the Anthropocene planetary scale systems that all of humanity is dependent on and should care for. So they will be in the future probably also important to be considered by the legal system. Now, how do these tipping elements work? Just very briefly here, the basic dynamics and physics and ecology of these elements is explained by the well-established theories of nonlinear dynamics and bifurcation theory. So the main idea is that a small perturbation of a system created by global warming, for example, even a small crossing of a threshold, let's say between 1.9 and 2 degrees of global warming, can lead to a collapse of one of these tipping elements, a destabilization, like it is shown here on the left-hand side for the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is a very important system that stabilizes the climate in Europe that we currently have. Also here on the right-hand side, another example, the Amazon rainforest, which is which can also show tipping points under, but here multiple pressures by global warming and deforestation are important. These tipping elements can be classified into two kinds. One are the so-called core tipping elements, which can have global, truly planetary scale implications, like the AMOC, again, the Atlantic overturning circulation, but also permafrost in the Northern Hemisphere, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets, Arctic ice, and also the Amazon rainforest. There are also regional scale tipping elements which have more regional impacts, should they be destabilized. There are more of them, of course, for example, the boreal forests of the Northern Hemisphere or low latitude coral reefs, which provide important, of course, food for a large fraction of the global population. And the critical thresholds that it's an important agenda for us and our colleagues to determine, to understand better the properties of these tipping elements and how they interact, and to constrain the thresholds, the threshold temperatures in terms of global warming under which these elements could be destabilized. And this is shown here on the left-hand side in this burning embers diagram. But just to, for one example, the Greenland ice sheet, for example, has a high likelihood to tip potentially between 1 and 3 degrees of global warming. This is what this plot shows. And the median, the central estimate for this probability is already at 1.5 degrees warming. So this means, this shows that the 1.5 degree and 2 degree targets of the Paris Agreement are actually very justified by the science of tipping elements now, because the risk of crossing tipping elements actually rises strongly between 1 and 2 degrees and becomes quite high above 2 degrees of global warming. And of course, there are a lot of uncertainties here and things which are still researched, but there is a solid evidence base now emerging, and even the IPCC reports are mentioning the tipping elements now as a substantial risk for humanity. Now, in our own research, we've looked into interactions between certain core tipping elements that could lead to further destabilizing dynamics, so-called tipping cascades. And what we found is that interactions tend to be overall destabilizing in this system of 4 core tipping elements: Greenland, Antarctica, AMOC, and Amazon rainforest, even if you consider many uncertainties and structural unknowns even on the interaction network structure. And this risk analysis reveals that not only are the interactions overall destabilizing, but the risk for triggering tipping cascades really increases strongly between 2 degrees and 3 degrees of warming above pre-industrial conditions, and the largest uncertainty is actually in the policy relevant warming range between 1 and 3 degrees of global warming. Remember that we have already 1.2 degrees of global warming now today. So we are well into the uncertainty, well into the risk zone in terms of tipping elements and in terms of tipping cascades already today. Now, how can the goals, this is then creates for us, of course, the big question: how can these risks be minimized? These risks of crossing tipping elements, but also of creating other large climate risks, such as those created by increasing extreme events, which is something that is actually, there's much more consensus, much more a much stronger evidence base for this, that climate change will generally have very strong implications above 1.5 and 2 degrees. It's not just about tipping points that we have to worry about, of course. So the current policies and actions, the estimate is that they would lead us likely to a warming of above 2 degrees up to 3.4 degrees. And only in optimistic scenarios, temperatures would stay below 2 degrees on average, but there's still an uncertainty range. And all of these policy target trajectories that are assessed here by the Climate Action Tracker actually lead us well within the high risk zone for tipping elements already. Now, one mechanism that we have started to investigate with more and more people from the community joining are so-called social tipping points for decarbonization. That could be a mechanism in addition to established proposals of policy instruments, economic development, and so on, could create conditions for rapid decarbonization and sustainability transition. So it's one particular mechanism that is studied that has certain symmetries, certain similarities in the underlying mechanisms to the negative climate tipping points. So we are moving from negative climate tipping points now to positive social tipping points. And so the main challenge is, of course, here again shown that producing net zero emissions globally by 2050, which is needed to reach the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, would need unprecedented, very large rates of decarbonization each year, up to 20% more towards the mid-century, 20% of reduction each year. This is the purple pathway here, truly transformative pathway. The business as usual is currently a 1 to 2% growth each year. And only deep historical crises like the Second World War or the collapse of communism have actually produced smaller rates of decreasing emissions annually, but nothing compared actually to these large rates. And we know that current policy is not delivering on this. We've seen that the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh hasn't produced too encouraging results. So this is why the question was asked, are there alternative ways to trigger, to produce such a large change, not just the classic climate negotiations. And we've done an expert elicitation, a large expert elicitation on potential social tipping elements for decarbonization, together with Ilona Otto, who's now at the University of Graz. And this expert elicitation has produced 6 main cluster social systems that have the potential, according to the experts, to show social tipping points that would be beneficial for a fast decarbonization trajectory. And they include here the energy production system, of course, with removing fossil subsidies and distributed energy generations as important interventions that were mentioned by the experts, but also here human settlements with carbon neutral cities, financial market divestments, education system, climate education, the information feedbacks, creating information feedbacks by more stronger greenhouse gas information disclosure, greenhouse gas emissions information disclosure, and finally also the norms and value system, where revealing the moral implications of fossil fuels, such as the Fridays for Future movement has done. For example, think of Greta Thunberg. This has been all revealed by the experts, and they've also commented on how these social tipping elements may interact. And this is, of course, all this is subject to a lot of ongoing research that we're doing now, and that colleagues in the community are also doing. So very, very active and interesting research area at the moment. Just to show one example here for data that we've collected on the Fridays for Future movement. This is from the German Politbarometer, and it shows that for the past 20 years, results of surveys with German voters that were asked whether they think that the environment is an important problem. This is in panel A. And you can see this peak, truly large peak that happens here between 2018 and 2020, which is in parallel to the Fridays for Future movement before the Corona pandemic struck. But then you can actually see how it's rising again after the worst Corona lockdowns and so on. So there's quite an interesting, maybe there's a case to be made here. And we discussed this in our paper in ecological economics, that this might be an example for a social tipping process ongoing in a certain, with social, related to social movements and climate attitudes in the population. Now, we are doing, it's important to, of course, to study this in more detail. So we are following now a lot of work on data analysis and modeling of the underlying social network processes that can generate such social tipping points potentially. And they include, of course, complex contagions, so spreading processes on complex networks, on social networks, and also network reorganization processes. And this can be then studied for different potential social systems that have the potential to show tipping elements. A final slide here is on, of course, I've now talked about the risks of climate tipping elements. I've talked about the potentials and the initial knowledge that is being collected about potential social tipping points, and of course, a better understanding of the interactions of the underlying processes is needed now, and also importantly of, for example, of the different time scale and spatial dimensions that these systems work at, and it's really that only when we are understanding better this integrated system, we think that we can find and highlight better and maybe more likely pathways for truly sustainable development and climate mitigation. And yeah, with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donges. I think this was a really interesting insight into your research, which is very important. Especially, I find it really, really astonishing how these concepts with planetary boundaries and Earth system and tipping points are now becoming like a lens through which we look at climate transformation also on our societies. So I think this is a really nice way to introduce our second prize winner's talk. Dr. Aykut will now talk on social dynamics of decarbonization and assessment framework. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Yes, so thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to the German Research Foundation for organizing this great event and for having me on this panel. And as you will see, there are many connections between my research subjects and my talk and the talks of Anna-Julia Seige and Jonathan Donges. So the panel is really well, there's a well fit between the different research directions. But first, I will take a step back, and I hope you can see my slides. If not, please interrupt me. Very often when we talk about energy transitions or decarbonization, we are confronted with images or graphic representations like these here. So what do they show, or what do we see here? We see representations of rapid technological change. We see the substitution of one technology, more precisely one technological system. Here it is the horse carriage. By another one, the automobile powered by gasoline. So we see changes in technological systems that often go hand in hand, go together with changes in energy technologies. And I believe this focus on technology and technological innovations, this hope, we could also say technological change, pervades much of research and also policy debates on decarbonization and climate policy. And we heard now in both of the talks before mine that we really have to pay attention to social dynamics and to the way that societies respond. But when we look into a concrete debate here on the debate on the German net zero transition, you see a series of recent reports that have been issued to analyze the transition, the possible pathways to a transition for a German net zero transition. All of these reports here take as a starting point Germany's targets in the 2021 Climate Protection Law, which is the translation, German translation of the global temperature targets, and which stipulate that Germany has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 65% until 2030 and achieve climate neutrality by 2045. And what these reports do, and they stand for a general approach, I believe, to decarbonization, to energy transitions, is that calculates pathways, technological and economic pathways to reach these goals. And in so doing, they depict a transformation of the energy system, including, for example, coal phase out, including a shift away from internal combustion engine and towards renewables, green hydrogen, e-fuels, and biomass. And what you see then are trajectories like these on the bottom, optimal pathways to ramp up these different energy technologies, such as PV, wind or heat pumps, or evolutions in energy demand. A common feature, am I showing this? A feature of all of these scenarios and model simulations is that they imply deep transformations in regulations, in infrastructures, in markets, in ownership patterns, and even in social practices and habits. But they rarely lay out explicitly what these changes are. And another problem that these scenarios and simulations often have is that they translate very poorly into reality. So very often political regulations fail to be adopted or to be implemented. We experience political backlash. For example, if you look into in the US political system, but not only, we experience resistance against technologies which slow down their deployment. We see that market structures or consumer practices are slow to adapt, etc. So when these scenarios and pathways materialize, they often do so very partially and often in ways that are very different to those smooth curves that we see here. And the result is then, here you see the German Minister of the Economy and Climate Protection, Robert Habeck, in his first press conference in January 2022. And what he points at is a representation of the optimal reduction pathway that Germany should be on, and the gap between that pathway and Germany's actual development in terms of achieving its climate goals. So according to the calculations of the ministry, Germany would have to triple the speed of the transition to reach its targets. And recently, the German Expert Council for Climate Policy has confirmed in its 2-year assessment that without a paradigm shift, that's how they call it, Germany is unlikely to reach its decarbonization target. So of course, this does not only hold for Germany. Globally, the world, we saw it in Jonathan Donger's talk, is not on track for reaching the goal of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. And not on track either to decarbonize the global economy and reach net zero carbon emissions. So how can we make sense of the difficulties of implementing these optimal reduction curves calculated by techno-economic models, and what role can social scientists play in these debates, and perhaps in injecting a dose of realism into these curves and into these debates on climate futures. A common response then, or a common task that is assigned to social scientists historically in debates on technological change is to research acceptance or acceptability of certain technologies. So asking the question, why do people protest, for example, against certain technologies? Why do they resist against their implementation? More recently, we have had very interesting research on the feasibility of technological solutions, but which I would say also prolong research on acceptance because they share a common starting points in the question of technologies and technological innovations. And in terms of the basic question, which is why do societies fail to adopt these technologies? So it is really against this backdrop that we at the Excellence Center, a cluster CLICS, Climatic Change in Society here in Hamburg, have established what we think to be a new method for assessing climate futures, and which turns the question upside down and starts not with technology, but with society. And in doing so, we want to answer the overarching question of the Excellence Cluster, which is which climate futures are possible, but and which are plausible. What does this mean? By plausible futures, we mean not only those futures which we expect, which are within the realm of our understanding of physical, techno-economic, and social systems, but also those futures that we expect to manifest with appreciable probability, even if we cannot quantify this probability yet. So what we are interested in is to analyze the current physical, techno-economic, and social dynamics which influence the probability with which a particular climate future might occur and plausibly manifest. And so instead of focusing primarily on techno-economic drivers of change, we highlight the role of societal processes, societal agents in processes of social change. And we believe that this is really an important gap in existing research on climate futures. So what does it mean to start with social processes? We first assess a range of potential social drivers for decarbonization. These social drivers are then analyzed through a focus on their historic trajectories and path dependencies, but also on emergent dynamics. I will now illustrate this to make it more concrete. Without, of course, being able to go too much into detail at this point, but I hope we can perhaps address some of your questions in the discussions afterwards. So here you see a graphic representation of what we call the social plausibility assessment framework. And on the left, we see a series of social drivers that we identified and that we conceptualize as overarching social processes that generate change, either towards or away from full decarbonization. In the first assessment, we identified 10 such drivers based on literature reviews and on our own expertise. And this list, of course, is not definitive. Other drivers might be added in subsequent assessments. So these include political drivers such as UN climate governance and climate-related regulation. Of course, these are very important, and we all know that they play an important role in decarbonization. But we also have civil society drivers. We heard already the role of climate protests is probably very important. Climate litigation is a process that we looked at. Fossil fuel divestment is another one. We also looked at drivers based on economic processes and subnational action. So transnational initiatives have gathered a lot of attention recently. Corporate responses are, of course, important. And also the question, do we see actually shifts in consumption patterns? Two drivers then denote processes that unfold in the background, which are important for social dynamics more generally. These we labeled as knowledge production and climate-related reporting or climate-related journalism. So how did we proceed? We first analyzed the direction of these drivers and their path dependencies. So this means what would happen if these processes continue in their current trajectory. We then identified contextual conditions that enable or constrain these drivers. So this describes the institutional, structural, material environments of these drivers that either facilitate or inhibit momentum towards decarbonization. And third, we sketched the contours of what we call a global opportunity structure for decarbonization, to which I will return in a second, but which very briefly consists in the sum of political, normative, and economic resources and constraints for societal actors that engage in climate action. So let's have a closer look at how we assessed a few of these processes. For example, two teams of researchers had a closer look at climate litigation and UN climate governance. And we find that both processes have recently gathered momentum towards decarbonization, but not strong enough to really drive deep decarbonization. So we all remember, for example, the Glasgow COP last year relaunched UN climate governance and global negotiations after a break that had been caused by the corona pandemic. We also remember, and we just heard of high-profile cases court cases won against governments, such as the case before the German Constitutional Court, such as also the Ochenda case in 2015 before the Dutch Supreme Court, as Anna Julia Seiger just told us a minute ago. So we then looked into the context conditions for both of these processes. And for example, UN climate governance depends heavily on the overall geopolitical context and tensions between superpowers, China and US. Climate litigation depends on the existence of strong judicial institutions, on the existing body of law, and on legal practice. It is also affected, and that is, of course, where the networks effects that Jonathan Donges just mentioned come in. It is also affected by scientific knowledge on causes and effects. So before courts in climate cases, we have to, or the plaintiffs have to establish causality between climate actions, between emissions and climate damages, for example. And so another element that recently affected climate litigation were changes in the composition of the US Supreme Court. So this allows us to not only look at the current dynamics of these processes, but also to give an educated guess about future evolutions depending on changes in these context conditions. So our result is that in both cases, we see a dynamic towards decarbonization, but not towards deep decarbonization, and we don't expect path departure or decisive acceleration. We even see in some drivers that they don't point into the right direction at all. So consumption patterns, for example, have been assessed as not pointing in the direction of deep decarbonization. We see steep rises in electric vehicle sales, but also a trend towards heavy SUVs across the world. More and more people in developing countries are adopting carbon-heavy lifestyles. So consumption patterns are not evolving in line with what would be needed for decarbonization and what would be necessary to achieve rapid technological change. So what are the overall results? We find that deep decarbonization by 2050, or the low emission trajectories of the IPCC compatible with these goals, are currently not plausible from a social science point of view. All 6 of the drivers point to decarbonization, but none to deep decarbonization, and 2 drivers even point in the wrong direction. These are, alongside consumption patterns, also company responses. But we also find an emerging global opportunity structure for climate action. Now, I will not be able to go into much detail here, but what is very important for us is to also show that societal agents, from youth movements to city networks, are producing climate action resources and opportunities which can be used to establish new climate action scripts or new forms of climate action that could change the context condition of drivers in the future. So an example is that climate litigation efforts create legal precedents. And these legal precedents, together with global temperature targets, and it's very nice that all of these have been introduced already by the speakers before me, can in turn be used by financial activists or financial regulators to re-evaluate the risks of companies that fail to comply with a low carbon future. So this may in turn change the context conditions for corporate climate actions. So even though the social drivers don't point at the moment towards deep decarbonization, we find signs of hope in terms of new opportunities for future progress to a low carbon future. So very briefly, and this is my last slide, the next steps, we are currently preparing the 2023 Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook, which will further establish and develop the social plausibility framework. And we are currently also preparing a social plausibility assessment for Germany, which will start hopefully in May or June 2023, with support from the MacArthur Foundation. And where we will look especially also on interactions between global and national dynamics. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Great, thanks to your very interesting talk. And I think you brought together many patterns that we have heard already today. And I think this bringing together is really important to have this overall picture. And from my research perspective, I think it's also really interesting to have this plausibility question in mind, because not all kind of climate litigation points towards decarbonization, and not all courts decide in the same direction. So I think this is really important. And I have many questions. I hope you have many questions too, which you can take with us in the 5 minutes break. We will meet again at 10 a.m. in German time and at 6 p.m. in Japanese time, and to hear to start the great and big panel discussion. I'm looking forward, and see you in some minutes. A short break for our second part of the conference, the panel discussion on planetary boundaries and social dynamics of decarbonization. We will now have a closer look on the issues raised in the talks by Dr. Donges and Dr. Aykut. We've just heard in the first part of this conference, and I'm happy to chair this panel discussion. Our panelists will add insights from their respective perspectives on environmental governance, climate mitigation, and resilience building. I'm happy to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Shinichiro Asayama. He has obtained a PhD at Tohoku University and is now a senior researcher at the Social Systems Division of the National Institute for Environmental Studies in Tsukuba. As an environmental social scientist, Dr. Asayama studies the role of narratives and imaginaries in the societal debates around climate change. His research is broadly focused on the politics of scientific knowledge and technological imaginaries in the science policy interface of climate change. He proposes a discourse about climate change that enables us to reimagine life under changing circumstances. Dr. Asayama, I'm very much looking forward to your comment to the two talks, and I would be also very interested if you have spotted during the talks we have heard today good or bad examples for narratives about climate change scenarios.
Thank you, Dr. Seigert. Thank you for having me this interesting event, and I'm really enjoying the three speakers' talks. But first of all, let me congratulate the two speakers, Dr. Donges and Dr. Aykut, for receiving this prize. And actually, I met the Stefan and Dr. Aykut more than 10 years ago. Both of us were still PhD students. So, and then we could meet up again, and then 10 years later, and now you are receiving this and he was actually the very excellent PhD student when we were PhD students. So I have no surprise about this honorary prize winning. Anyway, so let me just give me some of the 2 cents and my comments and observation about the three speakers' talk. And my expertise it's in studying the Lord of the languages and try to understand how people creating the meanings to understand what the climate change means for the people's life, and how people make sense of the challenge of the climate change and so on. And one of the things I find interesting is about particularly Dr. Donges talks about the tipping points, how the tipping points becomes a quite central idea to understand the risk of the climate change, but also it's now applied to the understanding how to make a change of the society to avoiding this, triggering the climate tipping points. And then when I look at when we look at the history of how the idea of the tipping points emerges from, is quite interesting because it is actually not, it was not used as a scientific concept, but it was actually used in a more public, and narratives. And for instance, like particularly the famous books written by the Canadian author, the Michael Gladwell, The Tipping Point, at a point, actually the one of the things considered the spreading idea of the tipping point. And this idea actually picked up by some of the prominent climate scientists like James Hansen, also the John Schrenkhuber, who are the founding director of the PIC, the institute where Dr. Dungus working. So the idea of the tipping point, which is applied to understand the society, how the society changed very quickly and non-linearly, actually now apply to the understanding that the physical climate systems, how these climate systems interacting and then creating the non-linear change. So that this kind of the interaction between the society and human, the planet is actually this dynamics between and interlinking is actually, we could see that actually through the language of the tipping point. And then now that Dr. Dungus actually the research and tried to apply this idea of the climate tipping point to understand how we could creating the more positive social tipping point. And so there's always this actually study, the research by Dr. Dungus actually telling us that our society and the planet is actually inescapably actually linking each other. So we couldn't actually separating, and science and society actually we need to actually understand the whole interlinkings and relationship between the science and society, and that's actually the challenge of the climate change actually posing to us. But then I have I want to actually really pose some of the maybe a provocative question to Dr. Dungus. As one of the things that I think the idea of the tipping point is quite interesting, and especially to see how society changed very quickly and non-linearly. And I think you pointed out that the example of the Friday for Future movement, and it's quite interesting because when in 2018 the Greta Thunberg, she was just a nobody, but suddenly in a year later she became the global icon of the youth climate movements. So that's dramatic shift of the one small the girl becoming just the one the school student in Sweden and become the global icon is actually telling how society can easily to change. And it's also telling how the people can, the norms and values of human people can easily to change. But then when we look at the talks by the Dr. Aykut, it's also telling a different story about the difficulty of creating the change in society, in particular because of our society, our economy, and hugely embedded to using the fossil fuel. So it's not the achieving the net zero goal or decarbonization. It's not something we could make quick change, but it takes a quite long committed actions. So my question is perhaps even though we could creating some sort of more non-linear adaptive change of our minds and norms and values, how could we translate this change of the norms and values to actual change in the economy and the energy systems? That is, I think, one of the big challenges we are facing, because nowadays many of people actually have sense of the urgency and a sense of crisis. We need to make urgent actions. Still, we are facing the steeping rise of the GHG emissions and globally. So this gap between the increasing sense of the urgency, but still we are stubbornly in some way continue to using the fossil fuel is actually the problem. And I'm sorry, I overload with time my talks, but I wanted to also pose a question to the Dr. Aykut. And so you actually identified the 6 positive social driver actually to catalyzing the change to the decarbonizations, but also like to like a negative change, like in driving forces. But I think you're portraying this more global picture. But I guess like when the Dr. Zeigers talk about like a difference, like in case of the climate litigations, the social context is quite different. So we couldn't actually talk about like so how the German like transitions, catalyzing it's also like in how the like in Japanese like an energy transitions happening. So could you a little bit more elaborate on like how do like different social contexts is like in how you take into account the research? These are like different like social contexts in your framework. So I'm sorry for like a long talk, but that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Asayama. I think the 2 prize winners, maybe you note the questions, and then we will have time after all panelists' inputs to respond. I will now introduce our next panelist, Dr. Chiho Oji. She is Associate Professor in the field of Global Environmental Architecture at the Graduate School of Global Environmental Studies of Kyoto University. Together with her PhD students at the graduate school, Dr. Oji and her colleagues explore sustainable human living environments. They take local culture and environments into account when researching local and traditional ways to adapt to global environmental conditions, ranging from enhancing nature to natural disasters. As climate change is said to influence natural disasters like flooding and extreme weather conditions, we would like to learn from Dr. Oji's research, which aims to create and develop practical policies, plans, and designs to mitigate the risk of climate change. Dr. Oji, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Let me share my screen first. Here you go. So first of all, I would like to congratulate 2 presenters for receiving award. And I am doing community-based disaster management studies in Japan and other countries. And I'm just trying now to try to figure out how my research might fit into 2 of your researches and then discussions. But as I often spend time in the local communities, maybe I will talk about a view from the general public. So in the community level, I think decarbonization is still a very far sort of like a topic or in recognition. But people started to feel the influence of the climate change. And then climate change is greatly now like related to the disaster occurrence. So maybe I can explain a little bit about natural disasters and how the traditional knowledge to cope with disasters are like current situation in Japan and what are the issues. So as you see in these photos, we have been facing different kind of disasters in Japan and worldwide. And earthquake and mountain eruptions are different, but many climate or climate change related disasters are occurring almost like every day, everywhere, and no change, poor or rich. So because of the climate change, the magnitude and the frequency of the natural disaster has been increasing. And then maybe like 10 or 20 years ago, people are still doubting, like, is it really a climate change or is it like a global warming? But like nowadays, like people already started to realize that, well, this is actually happening and the impact is large and real. So then it is affecting, and it will affect people's lives or our lives and societies. So in Japan, not only the typhoon, but like training, that they call it training in English, but happens one after the other. And that leads to the continuous heavy rain and increasing the probability of the floods or landslide nowadays. And that's the photos on the above. And then in Europe and US, the wildfires are almost every year event now. The drought, the shortage of water, the heat, and winds, and all these conditions together with geographical conditions, the forest situation, the architectural designs and city plannings makes this fire occurs and even grow. And that will already exceeding our capacity to sometimes cope with these fires. Traditionally, like I just wanted to take Japanese experiences or lessons. Traditionally, the human settlements are often affected by disasters. And then we built our homes and communities. And then sometimes we have to relocate or resettle if necessary. So in order to fight with these disasters, or sometimes they use the cope with disaster, and some countries say living with disasters. We form our like ancestors to the people, current people have developed many different like engineering and architectural and social and many other solutions to cope with these disasters. And just a little bit of example in Japan, like the above ones are like more like engineering strategies that we used to have. And then the left one is agaria it's called agaria, and they elevated the floor and built a house or evacuation homes so that during the floods people can evacuate. And then, like more importantly, like people in the community used to work together to fight with or cope with disasters traditionally. But how about now? The situation has been changing, and new people started to move into these traditional communities. So the situation in urban and the rural is different, but I think in the modern society, like a traditional way of coping with disaster or ideal of community effort, like fighting together with a disaster, becoming more difficult. So, but there is a one, like as Stefan mentioned, like how the society respond. This is just an example, but we usually say like people likes to learn from people like history, but they don't never learn from the history. That's the saying in Japanese. So but people likes history. So like now we were trying to educate or try to read some lessons learned from the historical perspectives, and then apply it to the modern society, not direct translation, but like we can read some, like take out from the lessons and then discuss together with the current people so that they can have a little bit more like climate change adapted lifestyle or decarbonization concerned actions of the daily life. Okay, that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to have introduced also the aspect of climate change adaptation to this conference. Our next speaker is Akiko Yoshida. She is in charge of the topics climate, nuclear energy, and power shift campaign at the non-governmental organization Friends of the Earth, Japan. Akiko Yoshida has been involved in activities related to Fukushima and the energy shift since the 2011 earthquake and nuclear power plant accident. She is in charge of administrative affairs for the E-Shift Association for realizing a new energy policy without nuclear power. In 2015, she launched the Power Shift campaign to promote the choice of renewable energy. Akiko Yoshida, I'm very glad to have your input now here, and maybe also with the introducing question to you, what is the discourse on energy in Japan today? This would be very interesting. I hand over to you.
Guten Tag und guten Abend. Ich heiße Akiko Yoshida von Friends of the Earth Japan. FOE Japan.
FOE Japan is NGO environmental organization. The German BUND is Friends of International. Is a Friends of International network, and we work together with them. And we exchange information and collaborate as needed. I'm from NGO, while you're from the academics, you're scientists, so I will probably give you from a different perspective than yours. And I will talk about the energy policy in Japan. So Dr. Dongus and Dr. Aykut, congratulations for the award. And as I was listening to your speech, we need to stop climate change from the scientific perspective. We talked about planetary boundaries, and there's a big gap or disconnect with the Japanese and Japan's energy policy.
Fridays for Future のような
Fridays for Future movements. These kind of movements are important, as you said. In Japan, Fridays for Future Japan. This movement started from February 2019. Initially, it started out with about 10 people, high school students and university students. But from there, it spread to around 30 places in Japan. So there are now a lot of groups formed. And as we do see some new people joining, leaving, but this Fridays for Future movement is still going on in Japan. NGOs like us working with these young people in Japan to approach the Japanese government and also the public. And what those people are claiming is the climate justice, the idea of climate justice. North-South gap, wealth gap, and there's a wealth gap even within the same country. There's also a generational gap. The reason for the climate change lies in rich countries, rich people, but the negative impact goes to developing countries and also the poorer people, and there's irreversible damage done on those people, and those people are starting to raise their voices. The other day, COP27 was held in Egypt, and civil societies in Africa and around the world talked about this gap, climate change, and also the climate justice, and then said that Africa should not be made a victim of it. And in Japan, on November 9th, received a fossil award. And Japan's energy policy relies on the fossil fuel, thermal power, and also relies largely on nuclear power. We should be promoting the renewables and shift towards cost energy efficiency, but this is not, the effort is not sufficient yet. Especially among the fossil fuels, coal, thermal power should be phased out. But in Japan, there are still highly efficient coal being used. And actually, the new coal thermal power plant is going to go online in Yokosuka. So this is a very ironic situation. And this year in September, Fridays for Future movement of young people went onto the street. So climate crisis is an issue of life, and about 400 people gathered. From about 2 years ago, under the pandemic, society and the world has been shaking, and FOE Japan system change under pandemic, we have been working on it. And of course, we need to work on renewables, efficient use of energy, but not only that, we also talked about the need for the citizens' participation and to make sure that working people will be protected. And also discrimination and the disparities will be removed. And we need to realize the gender equality. So these kind of social inequalities have to be addressed. So we want to work on climate issues along these other issues. And lastly, at FOE Japan, this July, put together this climate change card game, Karuta. Karuta is a traditional Japanese card game. And we focused on the idea of climate justice in putting together these cards. So I'd like to introduce you to some of them. This is in front of the Japan's diet. Climate change will not be able to disregard climate crisis anymore. So which world do you prefer? Deciding with everyone or deciding on your own? And energy policy in Japan goes without citizens' participation. And citizen society or environmental organizations are not represented in the energy or the climate discussions in Japan. So why it's only men that's talking? In Japan, the gender gap index is very low. So that members are usually men who are involved in the policy making. What we are looking for is a society that does not leave anyone behind. It's important to make sure that people can live as they wish as we try to achieve the to address the climate issues. And also this relates to human rights issues as well.
Many thanks for this insight. I think you added an important perspective from the NGO perspective, but also I'm very glad that you highlighted the importance of climate justice dimensions such as intergenerational justice and gender equality. So many thanks for your input. Our next speaker is Dr. Tomoko Hasegawa. She is Associate Professor at the College of Science and Engineering at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. Dr. Hasegawa conducts research related to global environmental issues, particularly climate change. She uses computer simulations called integrated assessment models that provide integrated analysis of energy, economy, agriculture, land use, water use, and other factors. So specifically, she's working on forecasting future greenhouse gas emissions, examining measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and conducting an economic analysis of the effects of climate change. Dr. Hasegawa, we are looking forward to your input. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I would like to say congratulations and Dr. Stefan and Inasan Dognes on this prize for your great job. And I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for this opportunity to input at this conference. And my research has been focused on climate change and mitigation from agriculture and food perspectives. So today I will be presenting some of our research findings today. IPCC said that the current emission trends are beyond the pathway to reduce to meet the long-term climate target, and rapid climate action is needed to achieve the targets in the Paris Agreement. And we investigated the impact of climate change and climate mitigation on food security. And our results show that by 2050, the total impact on food security under the stringent mitigation were much larger than those under the climate change itself, particularly in low-income regions. And this suggests that the stringent mitigation policies, climate mitigation policies, if implemented uniformly across all sectors and regions, would have a great negative impact on global hunger than climate change itself. And this negative impact of climate mitigation efforts are caused by conflicts between food and bioenergy crops, and high food prices and low income levels due to macroeconomic impacts of stringent mitigation measures. And climate mitigation itself has great benefits from avoiding climate change damages in many sectors. But if it is implemented uniformly across all sectors and regions, and climate mitigation may negatively affect food security. So it is necessary to carefully consider the adverse impact of climate mitigation measures and implement complementary measures to reduce such risks. And next study is about ending hunger, which is the second goal of the SDGs. The global trend of decreasing the global population of hunger ended in 2014 and increases afterwards. The world trend is not on track to achieve the SDGs zero hunger target. And we investigated the environmental impacts of food production required to end hunger. And increasing food production is a common approach for meeting growing dietary needs, but can pose environmental risks through the land development, deforestation, and increases in water and fertilizer use. So we ran several scenarios to end hunger by 2030, combined with various food policies to reduce the negative environmental impacts. For example, food support targeted to the poor, and reduced food waste and overconsumption, and food yield improvement. And the results show that if the current unequal food distribution is not improved, and food consumption levels increasing uniformly to the current level of developed regions, food production will increase by 20%, and increasing environmental impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions and nitrogen fertilizers and water use. In contrast, intensive food support is targeted only to the poor people and is combined with all food policies, then food production will reduce by 9% and significantly reducing the environmental negative impacts. And this result suggests that an integrated strategy is needed for meeting growing food needs while protecting the environment by providing food support to the poor and reducing food loss and overconsumption. And finally, we estimated the effect of extreme climate events on future global food insecurity. And climate change is expected to increase future extreme climate events. And this is a key concern for global food security. And the results show that the additional 11 to 36% of the global population may face hunger by 2050 under a once per 100-year extreme climate event by 2050. And our results suggested that the current reserve is sufficient, even in the worst case of climate change. However, in the regions such as South Asia, the amount of food required to offset the food insecurity under the extreme climate is triple the regional current food reserve. So this suggests that it's necessary to prepare for adaptation measures against emergency through the food support to the poor and vulnerable people. And also a large food reserve and international trade and food aid, etc. And here are some thoughts from our recent studies. And overall, these studies shows that achieving multiple targets like SDGs or planetary boundaries requires an integrated strategy. And no single policy or effort is sufficient to achieve these multiple goals. And it is important to consider the types of impact each measure will have on another measures in the implementation of inclusive climate policies and mitigation efforts. That's all I prepared. And related to the presentation by two winners, I have two questions to each speaker. And first, I would like to ask Jonathan Domnes. We climate-related researchers has analyzed climate impact and mitigation in a certain research framework using the RCPs, where the lowest climate temperature increase is equal to the 1.5 degree target. And my question is, do you think we should put more effort on climate mitigation to achieve below 1.5 degree to avoid tipping point? And also, do you think we should do more research on the scenario below 1.5 degree? That's a question to the Jonathan. And second to the question to the Stefan. You said current consumption patterns are not towards decarbonization. So I'm wondering how it would be possible to make consumption pattern change to decarbonization. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hasegawa, for your input. Now I would like to give Dr. Aykut and Dr. Donges a few minutes each to answer to the comments and the questions that have been raised. And maybe we just keep the order we have had before, and I hand over to you, Dr. Donges.
Yes, thank you very much for these great interventions and discussion points. So I just made a lot of notes and will try to respond to some of your points that you raised. And let me also start with the order of presentations, if that's okay, by the other panelists. Dr. Asayama he talked about the properties of social processes and I think that the role of narratives and so on. And it's a bit difficult for me, I wouldn't say difficult for me to respond, but it's of course, I think one, in response to his statement, I would like to maybe briefly try to explain a bit better, first, very briefly, how the social tipping points would work. I mean, what is the underlying hypothesis here? And it is, of course, because I think I didn't say it so clearly in my talk, I think it is processes in social systems that can respond to a small perturbation or a small agential interaction, a small intervention by a large change, by a large transformation. So it's again this basic idea, very simple idea of tipping points, that a small change can produce a large change, right? And this is in this case for the social tipping elements for decarbonization, the discourse is about what small interventions, relatively small interventions, could lead to a large transformation or a large decarbonization. I think so, and this is also the basic idea of the Malcolm Gladwell book, for example, and also many other writers and the basic ideas that go back a long time in the 20th century about tipping points. And I think it is really, it raises a lot of normative questions and things that need more consideration. For example, what is considered small? What is a small intervention? What is large? Well, and I think the effect that we want to achieve, the deep decarbonization, that's actually more clear. But the small intervention, what do you still consider small? For example, that's one of the things needed to discuss. What agents, what actors are the ones that make an intervention? Is it what justifies that actually? How legitimate is this actually? This raises questions of democracy also and justice. Are there some actors? Is it their right to cause a large societal transformation? Are they legitimized, and by whom? And who will this change affect? What are the side effects, right? And all these questions are, I think, important in the context of what, Dr. Asayama mentioned. And then maybe one more specific point on the his point about a specific question to me. For example, how would one, if there was a social tipping, say in the norms and value system, for example, related to people's attitudes about climate change. And this is something we seem to be seeing in many countries, that there have been recent global surveys and reports published on this, that there is a rising climate, people are caring about climate change, they're worried about climate change. More and more, large percentages of the population in many countries, sometimes up to 70%, 80%. And now how does this translate into actual actions? And then it is, of course, I think to stay within this framework of social tipping elements, this is then when it comes to trying to understand interactions. So how could a tipping in the attitudes lead to a tipping in behavior? Already that is quite difficult. And there's a lot of social psychological research on this. And then even more complicated on the institutional level, how does such a change of attitudes in the population translate to maybe a really fundamental shift in the policies? But I think more importantly, the aspects that Stefan Aykut was talking about, the enabling conditions, the plausibility of certain pathways needs to be considered also when looking into these particular change processes in society. So I think that there's really a nice complementarity there, and a lot of potential for future discussion and maybe even collaboration. I find this very interesting, this perspective of plausibility assessment. To continue on, Dr. Uchiai was talking about extreme events, climate change, and traditional knowledge about adaptation and so on. And I think this is very important in also when thinking about tipping elements and potential strategies to adapt to tipping events, which might produce also large sea level changes on a longer time scale of several decades and centuries. How to, and of course, if you think about Japan, for example, or northern Germany, long coastlines exposed to extremes like storm floods and tsunamis in the case of Japan already. Now think about a rising sea level. This is actually what the big tipping elements in the Arctic and Antarctic will cause, and they're already causing sea level rise, and this is projected to increase very much in the next decades and centuries, so that we can expect several meters of sea level rise in the next couple of centuries, which is on these historical timescales. If you think back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, this is a relatively short time, and past societies have found ways, and I think this is very interesting. They have found ways to deal with very long timescales. I was talking about these timescale dissonances or timescale tensions between climatic and social processes at the end of my talk. And I think, for example, in Japan, I know that there are these tsunami stones. At least I heard about them anecdotally here in the media, somewhere in the forest where people put a stone maybe 1,000 years ago to tell everyone a tsunami reached to this point. So it's a message transmitted over 1,000 years, over many generations, that there's a bad disaster, you have to consider this, don't forget. And yeah, to a large degree, our societies today are missing these signals or ignoring them. So this is important to link back to these how can we start to learn again to care about long timescales and the deep future, because this can create potentially additional large incentives for deep transformation, because future generations will suffer at the current trajectory. There will be likely very deep suffering among many future generations. And maybe this also relates to the narrative perspective. Also to what Akiko Yoshida talked about, the justice dimension, right? Intergenerational justice is exactly what this links to, how this long-term perspective that is very important, and that is largely missing at the moment. So for me, it's again an important message from this tipping elements research, particularly on climate. This is really about mainly about the long-term effects of climate change. On the short term, we know climate change is already causing large damages today. It will do so much more in the next coming years and decades. One process being just increasing extreme events, but the tipping elements on decadal to centennial timescales will really create very large changes, like meters of sea level rise. So this is something we have to find ways to link to future generations and to care about them, and to in that way create intergenerational justice. Maybe, sorry for talking so long, but the final point on Tomoko Hasegawa's intervention would be that, yeah, she asked about what efforts would be needed to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees, and is research needed to study these pathways. So I think this is again very important when considering the climate tipping elements. In general, I find it in line with what also Stefan Aykut was saying. I find it quite unlikely and at the moment that we will be able to limit warming even below 1.5 degree. However, there is now a lot of research on so-called overshoot pathways, where global warming, this is the more likely scenario for the future, that global warming will overshoot, will go above 1.5 degree, maybe even 2 degrees, but then might cool down a little bit again, maybe after the mid of the century. And studying and these overshoots are very important to understand what their impacts are for tipping elements, because if an overshoot is short and not too strong, you might overshoot and still not trigger the tipping points. But if you stay above the thresholds for too long and too high, the risk of tipping will become very large. So it's important to study overshoot scenarios now, to limit the overshoots to as low as possible temperatures, and also to make them as short as possible. And this is, of course, a lot of research is needed on understanding how the Earth system overall responds to overshoots, but also what economic and social drivers produce overshoots, and so on. So this is some reflections. Thank you again for these great interventions and questions.
Thank you. I just quickly hand over to Dr. Aykut.
Yes, thank you also from my side for all these really interesting insights. I will not be able, I think, to address everything, but I picked some impressions, some reactions, and questions. So first to Shinichiro Asayama. I think, first of all, this questions of narratives, of course, is something that I'm also very much interested in another research context or other research project that I'm working on, which is on more specifically on global climate conferences. But of course, narratives are also enabling and constraining for many social drivers. So the way that we depict, for example, the benefits of specific policy options, of course, greatly affects the probability that policymakers will adopt them, or the way that climate change is framed in policy debates, of course, can then contribute to mobilizing or not. So I think that's really important research. Your question was more specifically on the different social contexts, for example, Germany and Japan. And I think when we look at the skeleton of different, if we assume that this approach in terms of different social drivers makes sense, different social processes, then the next step is to really look at which of these are predominantly global. So of course, global climate governance, probably also knowledge production, climate modeling, etc., is a globally connected phenomenon today, but some of these are also very national, very nationally located. They have very national dynamics, context conditions. So if to take again an example that has been brought up many times, climate litigation, of course, depends on very specific legal systems which are more or less conducive to legal actions. We have different bodies of climate law, although, of course, we also have global elements with global treaties, etc. So I think it would be very interesting and fruitful to do comparisons actually on this basis. And I really hope that we will be able to do that at one point. Then to the question of social disaster, of ecological disasters brought up by Jihu Ochiai. And I'm sorry for pronouncing the names. I'm trying to do my best, but I think that also is, of course, very important for us to consider, because such events can also trigger, as terrible as they are, but they can, of course, also trigger changes in political and economic processes and systems. So somehow one of the things that we're struggling with is how to integrate those into our analysis. And perhaps also one of the questions that I didn't go into, but a further step is also to conduct, similar to what we did for mitigation, to conduct plausibility assessments for adaptation. So under which conditions could it be assumed that sustainable adaptation will, or in fact, be happening? And of course, that is a huge and important field of research also. So to then Akiko Yoshida, I completely agree to the importance of not only social movements, but also broader forms of citizen participation. And I think very importantly, systemic change is change that has to be sustained over long periods of time. And if we know something about such changes, it is also that they need to be continuously supported by social dynamics. So if we look at what happened in the US, for example, with the overturning of the abortion rights decision, we see what happens when sudden changes are perhaps made for a certain period, but not anchored very deeply in many levels of society. So I think the importance of participatory, of broad societal support for policy measures is extremely, should be an extremely important focus of our research. So it's not enough to understand change, but it's also important to understand how to lock in change to create this broad support. So I think, yeah. And lastly, to Muko Hasegawa. So I really like this thinking of broadening of perspective to the feedbacks between climate policies and other policies, and that is, of course, also speaks to this point of the public support for policies. Now to your questions, how would it be possible to change consumption patterns? That's, of course, the $1 million question, and I would love to have a swift answer to it. But I think one way to think about it is in terms of course, feedbacks and interactions, again, with other processes. So there has been a report recently by the UK, a UK council body, in our hands, that looked at examples of individual of changes in consumption patterns. And a very interesting finding for me was that they compared also in one part of the report actions in terms of cigarette smoke, for example. And we all know how quickly this changed. Also, when I was in Japan 2010, there were still smokers wagons in the Shinkansen. We also had them here, and we know that these things changed a lot over a short period of time. And what the report shows, of course, is that for consumption patterns to change, it is very important to also have to accompany such changes with regulations and to have approaches that combine regulatory with other measures. So perhaps the answer would be that we shouldn't wait for consumption patterns to change, but that they have to be actively shaped in some ways by building perhaps on ongoing changes and by building on things that where the technologies are also ripe. So I tried to address most of these. Thank you very much again for your inputs.
Thank you so much. So let me wrap up our discussions, our talks that we have heard. So today, I think there were so many different aspects of decarbonization coming up. We've heard about the physical state of the Earth systems, we've heard, especially the climate. We've heard about actual and possible societal reactions. We had the NGO perspective. We have been talking about law and international cooperation and the interconnectedness of different sustainability goals. We've heard about the risks for local communities. We've talked about the language we use when we talk about this. And what happened when I was listening and talking was really that I think we reached a positive tipping point today at this conference about the research we do and the exchange we do about this research. So I'm really glad and want to thank everybody for their contributions to this conference and all the open questions that come with this exchanging tipping point. We will take them to our group discussions, which is the next part of this conference. And I'm now happy to hand over to Axel Karpenstein for final closing remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Seiger. We only have 1 minute left, and I was reminded to speed up my closing words. But I first of all want to thank everybody for the brilliant presentations and the very interesting points, which are all a reminder how serious the situation we are facing with regard to climate protection. I think there's so much food for thought, which we will take into the group discussions, the subsequent group discussions. talk about them further. But I personally thought it was very intriguing and very insightful. So thank you very much for that. This today was the second online conference in the Heinz Maier-Leibnitz series. We had one already last year, the first one, where we discussed issues related to medicine and medical research and related ethical, legal, and social issues. The German Research Foundation, the DFG, and the DWIH, the German Center for Research and Innovation, I like to think of us as natural partners, because we, at the DWIH, we focus on providing a platform to showcase research, outstanding research, and to connect researchers from Japan, from Germany, from different countries. The DFG promotes outstanding research. So I think we're natural partners, and I'm very happy that we have this collaboration. Today we can see what a great event came out of this. So I'm very happy. I'd like to thank everybody for the contributions today. I'm very much looking forward to the subsequent discussions. On a technical issue, if you are participating in the discussions, you will have received a Zoom link. So once we close the room here, you can log onto the link, and we'll see you then in the Zoom meeting room with further instructions. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Ms. Seiger. And have a good day in Germany and a good evening in Japan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.